Hello and welcome to Action Sites, a podcast delving into the past, present, and future of activism organizations here in Houston, Texas. I'm your host for this episode, Molly Kiles. Today, we'll hear from Andrew Edmonson, former member of the activist group Queer Nation. He'll share his experience on the front lines of AIDS activism in the 1990s in Houston. Without further ado, let's meet our guest.
I'm Andrew Edmonson. I'm 56 years old now. Hobbies include independent documentaries, love to go to London, love to run at Memorial Park. I'm a current events junkie. I write for an LGBTQ magazine called Outsmart here in Houston, and that's been great because the editorial team there is open to me writing about politics or arts and culture, Houston LGBTQ history. I love doing that.
Edmonson moved to Houston in the 1990s, a pivotal and precarious time for the LGBT community. Queer Nation had just emerged as a spin-off of the ACT UP organization.
Queer Nation its mission was to confront and defeat homophobia in all its forms. And there were chapters all across the U.S. It was a very loose affiliation. There was nothing like a national structure. And Queer Nation was pure democracy, meaning there was not a president, there was not a board, there was not an executive committee, there were no officers. You walked in, I think it was Tuesday night at 7 o'clock at this meeting space in Montrose, and we discussed upcoming actions and how we were going to plan them and how we were going to execute them and how are we going to promote them to the media. And it became a very vital force after the murder of Paul Broussard. I really had a strong there, but for the grace of God go I, when I heard about Paul Broussard's murder. He was murdered July 4th, 1991, and he was out at a club called Heaven in Montrose. And I had been out at that same club, and I had left probably around 1 in the morning. I lived about 6 blocks from Heaven, and I was like, I'm going to walk home because it was close and it was in the neighborhood. And then, like, within a week, I heard about Paul Broussard being murdered, and I really had a there, but for the grace of God, go I moment. It also pushed a lot of buttons for me. So July 4th is this holiday in which we celebrate America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And it's like, gay people can't leave bars in Montrose without being attacked and murdered. How free are we? And then you had 10 teenage boys from the Woodlands, which is a Houston suburb, drive over an hour to come into Montrose to target gay men, to beat them up. And I'm like, how brave is that? How free is that? So we have this myth that's promoted on July 4th about American democracy and freedom and liberty and justice for all, but not everybody gets liberty and justice. Paul Broussard certainly did not get liberty and justice. His poor mother, who spent years making sure that the people who murdered him stayed in prison for as long as they can, she didn't get liberty and justice for all. An ambulance was called to pick up Paul Broussard. I do know that among certain quarters there was to get from Montrose to a hospital in downtown Houston. You and I could probably drive there in 10 minutes. And so among many in the gay community, there was a sense that it was just a queer who was bashed. Didn't really matter that he get urgent treatment. And so they took a few extra hours, and he died in the process. But he's only a queer, so what does it matter? I think there was a kind of underground rage that gay men were continuing to be harassed, and then it had progressed to gay men being killed. From one period from 1993 to 1995, 8 gay men were killed by predominantly white teenagers in Texas. And there was, of all places, Vanity Fair did a fantastic story by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist called Buzz Bissinger about, like, why is this happening in Texas? And they sort of made the parallel with the Ku Klux Klan in terms of extrajudicial violence and people being murdered. and what is going on in Texas. So I think a lot of people, when Paul Broussard were murdered, had this pent-up anger, and Queer Nation was an outlet. There was a larger context that was also going on of this was the height of the AIDS crisis. And Houston was always in the top 10 in terms of AIDS diagnoses, people testing HIV positive, AIDS deaths. And Queer Nation was not like the Houston Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus where you screen candidates, then maybe you'll elect someone and they'll stand up for you. It was like, let's take that rage and let's take it out into the streets and let's confront City Council, let's confront the Houston Police Department. James Baker once made an observation about a specific process that now it was time to break the china, meaning now we need to raise hell and make a scene and let people know that something must be addressed. There was a Republican administration in power at the time. They were running an election on Republicans have family values. This was around in the lead up to the 1992 presidential election. And as a wedge issue, the GOP wanted to exploit gay people and basically say Bill and Hillary Clinton are kind of counterculture leftists who smoke pot and will lead America down the wrong path. And George and Barbara Bush have family values, and they'll protect the traditional America that you have come to know and love. Well, if you were a gay man, that traditional America that had been promulgated during Ronald Reagan's administration and carried over to George Bush's administration basically didn't do much while your friends were dying. It took Ronald Reagan, I think, 5 years to mention AIDS. There was a front page article in the New York Times about how there were certain key issues that were emerging in the presidential campaign. And I remember the headline was, AIDS and gays emerge as key issues in presidential campaign. George Bush didn't seem that concerned about AIDS at all. And when there was a convention in 1992, the Republican National Convention, which was held at the Astrodome, and George H.W. Bush and all the Republican Party came here, at the 1992 Republican National Convention, AIDS activists and Queer Nation members from all across the U.S. descended upon Houston because there was a sense that the Bush administration was launching this homophobic re-election campaign based around family values, which was denigrating gay people. I was there as a member of Queer Nation, and we were protesting George W. Bush, and we were chanting things outside the Astrodome like 40,000 dead from AIDS, and where was George? So there was a sense that gay people were second-class citizens. People were furious with that. And so the opening night of the Republican National Convention, there was a protest. It did get a bit unruly, but the cops, which is specifically the Houston Police Department, were mounted on horseback, and they came in and they beat protesters. And it was like, honestly, straight out of 1968, the Chicago Democratic Convention, where you had police overreacting. One thing that was not as appreciated in Texas at that time was we have First Amendment rights, and you may not like what those crazy queers are saying outside the Astrodome, but they have the right to say what they want to say. And just because some people may perceive the gay community as socially undesirable, cops can't go in there and beat them up. One thing I was really proud of is I was public relations director for the Alley Theater at that point in my career. And the next day, within 10 hours, we organized a press conference where we talked about the level of police brutality that we experienced. And we had people who took off their shirts and showed the bruises where they had been beaten. And it got extensive television coverage. It was on the cover of the Houston Chronicle. But for a long time, there was a reluctance among the power structure to probe into what had happened that night. So probably a year and a half after the Houston Police Department beat protesters with billy clubs, we decided to stage a reenactment in front of the Houston Police Department. We borrowed some costumes from the Alley Theater. They were specifically kind of horse costumes, and we had people wearing police caps. And we reenacted right at 6 o'clock when the 6 o'clock news would start, because TV was very important. We did a reenactment in which HPD charged the protesters and beat them. This didn't just disappear, and we weren't just dismissed as those little rabble-rousers who need to shut up and go away and quit causing problems. And again, we were all over the news, and suddenly that reignited the issue, and it raised again the question of why is there not a more thorough investigation into the HPD violence in response to the Republican National Convention. And for me, that was classic ACT UP, Queer Nation, street activism. And so suddenly there were people who were talking about, why is Houston Police Department beating up gay protesters? And there's a longtime transgender activist, Phyllis Fry, and she talks about how in the 1970s in Houston, Black people were under attack from HPD, Hispanic people were under attack from HPD, the LGBTQ community was under attack from the Houston Police Department, and so it felt like the police were not your friends.
However, the police department was not the only discrimination the LGBT community in Houston would have to reckon with.
In 1985 in Houston, there was a bruising referendum. The city council had voted to implement a non-discrimination ordinance in hiring. It was very weak stuff. It was, you can't be hired or fired on the basis of your sexual orientation. That can't be a category that people discriminate against for City of Houston employment. It wasn't, we're going to extend benefits to domestic partners of LGBTQ people. It wasn't, we're going to enact gay marriage in Houston, Texas. It was simply, we're not going to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And it was resoundingly defeated. It went down with 80% of voters voting against it and only 20% voting for. And there was a mayoral candidate at that time, Louis Welch, and he thought that some TV mics were off, and he didn't realize that he had a hot mic. And someone asked the question, what would you do to address the AIDS crisis in Houston? And he responded, the first thing we do is we shoot all the queers. And it's important to understand that Louis Welch had been mayor of Houston from like 1963 to 1974. So he was not some far-right fringe figure. He was at the heart of the establishment. It was acceptable to say things like that in Houston in the 1980s. So there was a sense among certain gay men, certainly my friends and peers, that you were under attack with people coming in to gay bash you in the streets of Montrose, and you were also under attack from this virus, and your government didn't seem to really give a damn about whether you lived or died. And I think that what Queer Nation did was it took all that anger and frustration and gave a positive outlet for people to actually do something, which was typically a street protest that drew a lot of media attention and raised an issue. I saw a documentary once about, but there was a sense of extreme importance and that everyone had to step up and do their bit. And for me, living through the AIDS crisis, it felt like a similar dynamic of we're being attacked by an enemy, and you've got to rally together and you've got to take action. Gay people in Britain during the Second World War, when they were the only country left standing against Germany, and they were this small island, and Germany was being bombed constantly, and it was incredibly stressful. There was a sense of extreme importance and that everyone had to step up and do their bit. And for me, living through the AIDS crisis, it felt like a similar dynamic of we're being attacked by an enemy, and you've got to rally together and you've got to take action. Now, some people, even within the gay community, thought Queer Nation is a bunch of crazies. They take ill-advised actions that alienate people who might want to help them. At that time, as James Baker said, somebody needed to break the china and raise hell. And Queer Nation was there to stage those massive actions at the National Institutes of Health, to go to the White House with the ashes of people who had died of AIDS and pour those ashes on the White House lawn, to, shut down Wall Street, to protest pharmaceutical companies profiteering horrendously off of AIDS drugs that many people could not access because they didn't have money and they didn't have health insurance. I think sometimes you need that level of challenging the power structure. And I remember there was, in the early 90s, also in Houston, a group of feminists called the Women's Action Coalition, WAC. And they would come out and they had these drums, like sets of drums, and they would do public actions. And sometimes Queer Nation would collaborate with WAC. And they had a phrase like the Women's Action Coalition, backlash baby, demolition. And they would pound on these drums. And so if you were doing an event that was designed to catch the attention of the media, they were making a hell of a lot of noise. And here were these women out there with drums, playing percussion instruments, not the kind of typical stay-at-home and play the piano or flute. And they were loud and in your face, and they were not giving an inch. And I think sometimes you need those people. I think it's also important to have those insiders. I think of the Obama administration and the work to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the ban on gay people serving openly in the military. You needed insiders in the administration to ultimately make a decision to stop enforcing the Defense of Marriage Act, which wouldn't allow same-sex couples to marry. You needed insiders to help clear the way to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Each type of activism is important, but at that particular moment, it was a crisis, and someone needed to shoot a flare up in the sky and say, pay attention.
Amid political unrest and protests, Edmonson also witnessed the isolation that the AIDS epidemic could cause.
In the early 80s, you did have people getting into what I call spacesuits, and there was so little known about the disease, and people were so terrified by it that sometimes medical staff wouldn't even go into an AIDS patient's hospital room. They would leave at the door the food for their dinner or for their breakfast. And God forbid the patient should not have enough physical stamina to be able to come and open the door and get their food. I arrived in Houston in 1990. And in the early 1990s, things had gotten better. And we were able to go visit friends in the hospital. And there was a sense that people understand just how important that was, because people could feel so isolated and so abandoned and so kind of completely shunned by society if they had AIDS, that they needed to feel loved and connected to a group of people. I think that was another thing that would raise the emotional volume for a lot of people who were participating in Queer Nation and ACT UP, is that you'd go visit a friend in the hospital, you'd see that they were declining. That would kind of terrify you and sadden you, but it would also enrage you. It's like, why isn't someone doing something about this?
Yet while the odds seemed stacked against the LGBT community of Houston, they were far from powerless.
The arts community was terrific about stepping up. There was a design group in New York called Grand Fury, and they designed beautiful posters and advertisements about the AIDS crisis, designed to point out the fact that the government seems to be doing nothing. Gay people are dying and our government doesn't care. And many of them worked at top advertising agencies and were design professionals. So it had a kind of beauty and sophistication and clarity of design and message that was incredible. I think what you had here in Queer Nation is, I know a colleague of mine from the Alley Theater, he ended up being associate director of the Alley Theater. His name was Michael Wilson, and he's a theater director who went on to work on Broadway and to lead a very esteemed theater, the Hartford Stage Company in Connecticut. But he was very active with Queer Nation, and he had that sense of a theater director's eye and a sense of how to organize a protest to give visual content that would be very compelling and would draw people in. And they were bringing all that creativity to their response. So I think there definitely was a cross-fertilization between the arts community, the theater community, HIV activists. There was an event that was very powerful in Houston and organized nationally and internationally. There's World AIDS Day on December 1st. The arts community started in tandem on December 1st doing an event called Day Without Art. And the initial concept was, imagine if all the artists who died of AIDS, if their work was no longer available in this country. They would do some things like you take a black shroud and you would put it over a work by an artist who died of an AIDS in a museum. A real stroke of leadership, and that there was a concerted effort by high-profile organizations in the city to lead the city to greater understanding. And I remember there was a press conference where the heads of each of the major arts organizations talked about one person or one artist at their organization who they had lost in very human terms, and what that person contributed to the Houston arts community and what it meant to not have them now because they had died of AIDS. It was almost as if the gay community and people living with AIDS were pariahs who were suspect. But when you had organizations like the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Houston Grand Opera, Houston Ballet, the Alley Theater step forward and say, we have lost artists to AIDS. This is a problem that our community needs to grapple with. We need to treat people living with HIV with understanding, acceptance, and compassion. That was very powerful. You had to kind of cling to those victories because they felt so few and far between. There was a famous ballerina at Houston Ballet named Lauren Anderson, and World AIDS Day Day Without Art would typically fall during the run of the Nutcracker. And she, on numerous occasions, at the final curtain call where everybody's attended the performance and they're happy, would step forward and sort of silence the applause. And she was typically dancing the lead role of the Sugar Plum Fairy. But she would talk about today is World AIDS Day, and here's how many people in Houston have died from AIDS. We at Houston Ballet have been impacted by the AIDS crisis, and we've lost artists who were so important to this company. And to have someone who was as highly regarded as she was step forward and make a statement like that, I think went a long way to help open hearts and minds. So I do think that Houston's arts community should be very proud of its response during the AIDS crisis, because it tried to show up and it tried to help.
The LGBT community also found ways to take AIDS prevention into their own hands.
There were indeed community prevention efforts. There was a place called the Montrose Clinic. It's now referred to as Legacy Community Health, but it started in the late 70s before the AIDS crisis as a clinic where gay men and others could go to be tested for sexually transmitted infections. Then you have the kind of huge outburst of AIDS in the 1980s, and Legacy was sort of the institutional structure that was there. And so they began doing HIV testing. And for many people in the gay community, you wanted to be able to get your test done anonymously, because what you didn't want was to go and have your primary care provider through your work provided health insurance, if you were lucky enough to have that, do a test and have that be on your record, because those were periods where health insurance companies could exclude you for a pre-existing condition. So they could refuse to cover your HIV medications for a year because that was a pre-existing condition. And that was something that was addressed, thank goodness, in the Affordable Care Act. But it was a real reality that people lived with. But there was a sense that the Montrose Clinic was created by the gay community for the gay community. There's a gay historian who has been on faculty at both Yale and Columbia who lectured here.
The historian Edmonson mentions is George Chauncey, who delivered a lecture to Rice University about the impact of the AIDS crisis on the LGBT community.
There were two lessons that the gay community learned. One was that our relationships would not be respected. Meaning, if I had a gay partner and he died of AIDS and we had a house that we bought together but it was in his name, his family could come in and kick me out and tell me that I had no right to any of the proceeds from that house, that I had to get out of the house. You could have terrible situations like someone's life partner and their partner is sick with AIDS and they're in the intensive care unit, and you go to hospitals and hospitals wouldn't let you see your partner because there was no blood relation. You weren't a brother or a wife. And so this historian's thesis was, one huge lesson that the gay community learned is that our relationships have to be acknowledged and protected, so we can't be victimized like that. And then the second lesson that was learned was how devastating it was to not have health care, and the need for providing some type of hopefully universal health care that we could get to at some point in this country. Because when you had hundreds of thousands of people dying from AIDS, and many of them either didn't have access to insurance, or you had situations like I was talking about where you had a pre-existing condition where for a year you would have to find a way to pay $20,000 or $30,000 to cover the cost of your own HIV medication. That was a catastrophe. But he made a very compelling case that so much changed based on the experience of the AIDS crisis for LGBTQ people. And his theory of the case was that the reason in 2015 you had a Supreme Court decision in favor of same-sex marriage came directly out of the trauma of the AIDS crisis, in which relationships between LGBTQ people, romantic relationships, were completely disregarded by the law.
And while medical treatments for AIDS may have improved, the issue of health insurance coverage has not disappeared.
There was a period around, I think it was 1996-97, that a whole new category of drugs called protease inhibitors was introduced, and that was a huge game changer. And you went from having almost no medications that could help people living with HIV to a whole series of medications that could make it a chronic manageable illness. In the late 1990s, things got better. But what I think it's really important to remember is, bluntly, if you test HIV positive in this country and you don't have access to health care, HIV can be just as much of a death sentence in 2021 as it was in 1989 if you can't access medical care. And Texas has refused to take the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And it's estimated that if Texas took the Medicaid expansion, of the 5 million Texans who don't have health care, 1.4 million more Texans could access health care. And I think that if people were able to access care, they're going to get the medications that they need. And if they take those medications, they're going to become what's called undetectable, meaning they're not able to transmit the virus through sexual activity. So it's going to only help public health if that were to happen. I'm also aware that the stigma and prejudice that gays saw in the 1980s has not necessarily abated for African American people. And I think in recent years, African American women are one of the fastest growing target populations who are HIV positive. And I would venture an observation that a lot of that may be due to lack of health care. There was some horrifying statistic that if you were a Black gay man, there was a 50% chance that you would become HIV positive. If you were a white gay man, it was a 1 in 6 chance that you would become HIV positive. So just the racial disparities paint their own picture. While things have gotten better, you can't ignore the role that race and ethnicity play in people being disproportionately impacted by the HIV crisis and not able to access care. My perception is, and this is just my opinion, that the AIDS crisis dramatized how LGBTQ people were second-class citizens in America. And here we were dying of this epidemic, and the government didn't seem to care. And I remember, I think it was Larry Kramer, there was a disease called Legionnaire's disease, and it affected, I think, less than 100 heterosexual white men. But he made the point that there was great media attention paid to Legionnaire's disease, and the death toll was negligible compared to the AIDS crisis. But somehow, when it is LGBTQ people, people of color, intravenous drug users, America doesn't seem to care as much when they're dying by the tens of thousands. I also feel like in terms of the public policy response, AIDS was transmitted sexually, and so if you were going to have interventions that were effective, you were going to have to talk frankly about sexuality and gay sexuality, and that made the right wing of this country very angry. I think homophobia impeded the response to the AIDS crisis, but it worked both ways. Homophobia intensified the neglect of people living with AIDS, and it also fueled the hatred of people living with AIDS were perceived as less than human. My intense AIDS activism was from 1990 to 1995, and what was hard about that period is it seemed like you had so few victories. It seemed like people just continued to die. It seemed like that there weren't drugs on the horizon, and that was so overwhelmingly sad and painful. And you did have some victories. I remember Bill Clinton embraced the gay community when he ran for president in 1992. I remember Hillary Clinton and Tipper Gore went to the AIDS quilt. And it did seem like Bill Clinton's policies were better on AIDS. He did a lot of controversial stuff and sort of, at least on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, sold out the gay community. And even he later regretted that he implemented that policy and said that it was wrong and discriminatory. So it wasn't a complete victory. I would say Queer Nation was in decline by 1993. What I will say is you had people who went from Queer Nation and they joined the Houston LGBT Political Caucus. And they did a different type of activism work, what I would call the inside work of trying to elect public officials who will create change from the inside. But maybe it wasn't so much about doing actions. And one of the drawbacks of that also was it was a really intense period with Queer Nation for about 2 years. But because there wasn't that organizational structure, it kind of disappeared around the middle of 1993. And what I take from that is there's only so long that a group of people can function at high alert and can dedicate that type of energy emotionally, and also the time that it took. And that was incredibly empowering, but it also took a lot out of you. I think that's one of the reasons that Queer Nation sort of receded. I would also venture that when Bill Clinton was elected in 1993, there might have been some sense that the government was more responsive to the concerns of people living with HIV and that things were going to get better under a Democratic administration. Remember, he was trying to pass health care for everybody then, and that would have been huge for gay people or people living with HIV to be able to access health care. And I know there were some activists who felt like Clinton took the LGBTQ community's donations and their money and then implemented policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which prevented same-sex couples from marriage, and that the gay community got shafted for their investment in Clinton, and that there needed to be activists and ACT UP and Queer Nation who would continue to raise hell, because he still betrayed us, but he did it with a smiling face. And that is so valid and so needed. People still wanted to make a difference and to try to change the world.
Edmonson believes that the time for in-your-face activism is far from over.
I think that there is definitely a need for activism that raids hell. I'm so encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement. I feel like the racial disparities in our criminal justice system are shocking. Here in Houston last year, we had 6 unarmed men, people who were people of color, who were shot or killed by HPD, and that's unacceptable. The largest protest that I'm aware of that's ever happened in Houston took place during the height of the pandemic, and it was in response to the murder of George Floyd. And I think there were like 50,000 or 60,000 people, and I was so incredibly proud of Houston because it's not necessarily a city that does massive street protest. And it felt like the city turned out and the city said, we've got to do something better. What was demoralizing for me was Mayor Turner, an African-American politician, then moved ahead with a huge further investment in the Houston Police Department. And I spoke before City Council, and there were probably 50 other activists who spoke before City Council. And this was in the wake of George Floyd's murder, probably within 1 or 2 months. And to my mind, it was a very reasonable proposal of taking something like 20% or 10% of the budget for the police department and investing that in supportive housing programs and programs for inner city youth, and trying to invest in solutions as opposed to policing and incarceration. My perception is that Mayor Turner stonewalled that and prevented that from happening. I will also add as context that he was twice endorsed by the Houston Police Officers Union. So there's a tradition in Texas politics of you dance with them who brung you. But for me, that felt like there was an opportunity to create real change and criminal justice reform here, and we lost it. And it was sad and ironic that we lost it under an African-American mayor. What I tend to do a lot of is legislative advocacy, calling my elected representatives, meeting with my elected representatives, volunteering for pro-LGBT candidates. For instance, there was Congressional District 7, which for 50 years had been controlled by Republicans, and the seat had been held by a very homophobic Republican. And there was a challenger, Lizzie Fletcher, and she was close to my age, and I had friends who knew her, and they said that she was terrific. And I volunteered for her campaign, and she accomplished the impossible, which was unseating the Republican senator who had been there for 20 years, but Republicans had held Congressional District 7 for 50 years. She was reelected to office, and she was a sponsor of the Equality Act. And so for me, that feels like tangible change. And twice since then, the Equality Act, which would expand non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people to areas like education, housing, public accommodation. It would basically expand the terrific work of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to cover LGBTQ people, and would be a major step forward in our battle for civil rights. We got to try to make change happen where we can.
To close out our conversation with Andrew Edmonson, I asked if there was anyone whose memory he wanted to share from his time during AIDS activism.
There was a great guy named Brian Bradley who was a Houston LGBTQ activist, and he was a nurse, and he tested HIV positive, and he worked at MD Anderson, and there was intense media coverage of his situation because he came out as a person living with HIV, and he was a scrub nurse, and they were going to redirect him so that he would work in another department, and he was not going to be treated like a second-class citizen, and he felt like, no, I'm going to stay and do what I've trained to do. And he was fearless, and he was a major instigator with Queer Nation and with ACT Out. There was political candidate David Duke, who was affiliated with the KKK and who I believe ran for the Republican nomination for president in 1992. He was very anti-gay, and he had a political rally in League City, and Brian Bradley went to that rally with all his fervid supporters, and when he started speaking, Brian stood up in the middle of this crowd and unfurled a banner and yelled, "Nazi, go home," because he was also sympathetic to the Nazi cause. And Brian did that on several occasions. There was a fundraiser with Ronald Reagan, of all Republican donors, and he went in and sort of went undercover and acted like he was a good Republican and thought Ronald Reagan was great. And then when Reagan started speaking, he stood up in the middle of his speech and called on him to do something about the AIDS crisis. Brian had lost his partner to HIV/AIDS, and he was also HIV positive himself. I think he died around 1990, but I think it's Janis Joplin who talks about freedom is simply not having anything else to lose. And for Brian, I think he lost his partner. He was HIV positive, and so that gave him a freedom to speak truth to power and to raise hell. He was a flamboyant personality, and he really didn't care who thought that he was too effeminate or too obnoxious or too arrogant or too in your face. And he went on, like he was interviewed by Oprah. His situation with the employment discrimination was covered by lots of national media outlets. And for me, he was a mentor and a role model who manifested what it was like to be fearless and not to let the power structure roll over you.
That was Andrew Edmonson, former member of Queer Nation Houston, and I'm your host, Molly Kiles. Thanks for listening.